Hey there, night owls and fellow seekers of the bizarre. Tonight we're diving into the delightfully deranged world of medieval superstitions, where logic went to die, and common sense was apparently considered a form of heresy. So go ahead and get comfortable. Maybe light a candle for ambience, but not too close to anything flammable, because as we'll learn tonight, medieval people had some very specific opinions about fire and what it could summon. Before we begin this journey into humanity's most wonderfully irrational fears, take a moment to like the video if you enjoy falling asleep to tales of historical absurdity, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what completely rational modern superstition you definitely don't believe in, but maybe sort of follow anyway. It's always fascinating to see how little we've actually evolved. Now dim those lights, maybe put on some soft medieval lute music if you're feeling fancy, and let's drift back to a time when sneezing could literally be considered a life or death situation, and wearing the wrong colour could get you accused of consorting with demons. In the grand theatre of human civilization, few periods were quite as gloriously, magnificently unhinged as medieval Europe. This wasn't just an era of knights and castles and romantic notions of chivalry, though those things existed, usually covered in mud and smelling like they hadn't been washed since the Crusades. No, this was a time when the line between reality and supernatural terror was so blurred it might as well have been written in disappearing ink. Medieval people lived in a world that was, by all accounts, absolutely crawling with invisible threats. Demons lurked behind every shadow. Witches stirred cauldrons in every forest clearing. And the devil himself was apparently so bored that he spent his time hiding in perfectly innocent household objects, waiting to corrupt unsuspecting Christians who just wanted to churn some butter or milk a cow. But here's the thing that makes this period so endlessly fascinating. These weren't ignorant people stumbling around in the dark ages of human intelligence. Medieval scholars were translating Aristotle, building cathedrals that still stand today, and developing philosophical systems so complex they'd make modern graduate students weep. They were capable of breathtaking intellectual achievement. They just happened to also believe that carrying a rabbit's foot would prevent plague, and that looking at a basilisk, a mythical creature that was essentially a snake with delusions of grandeur, would turn you to stone. The medieval mind operated on a logic that was both deeply religious and profoundly magical. Every event, no matter how mundane, was seen as part of a vast cosmic struggle between good and evil. A cow giving sour milk wasn't just bad luck or poor farming practices. It was clearly the work of a malevolent neighbour who had learned to curse livestock. A storm wasn't just weather. It was either God's judgment on a sinful community or the result of some witch dancing naked under the full moon, commanding the elements to do her bidding. This worldview created a society that was simultaneously terrified and oddly comforted by superstition. If every misfortune had a supernatural cause, then every misfortune also had a supernatural solution. Lost your keys? There was a prayer for that. Crops failing? Time to organise a village-wide procession carrying holy relics. Husband cheating? Well, there were definitely spells for that, though the church frowned upon them, mostly because they were disappointingly effective. The result was a civilization that lived in constant awareness of the invisible world pressing in around them. They developed elaborate rituals to protect themselves from threats that existed only in their collective imagination. And yet these rituals became so central to daily life that failing to perform them was considered not just foolish, but actively dangerous. Medieval people created their own reality through shared belief, and then lived in terror of the monsters they had collectively summoned into existence. But perhaps most remarkably, many of these superstitions weren't just quaint village folklore. They were endorsed, or at least tolerated by the educated elite. Church officials who could read Latin and debate theology would also earnestly warn their congregations about the dangers of spilling salt or walking under ladders. University-trained physicians who understood human anatomy would prescribe remedies that involved grinding up unicorn horns, which were usually narwhal tusks sold by enterprising merchants who understood that medieval people would pay anything for magic, even if it came from a glorified Arctic whale. So welcome to medieval Europe, where rational thought went to die a slow, superstitious death, and where the most learned men in Christendom could simultaneously calculate the movement of celestial bodies and earnestly believe that those same celestial bodies were controlled by angels who might be offended if you didn't cross yourself the right way while looking at them. Let's start with something that sounds innocent enough: sneezing. In the modern world, a sneeze is a minor bodily function that occasionally produces awkward social moments and definitely spreads germs. In medieval Europe, a sneeze was basically a spiritual emergency that required immediate intervention from both God and anyone within earshot. Medieval people believed that sneezing was the soul attempting to escape the body, a theory that sounds almost charming until you realize they thought this was a very bad thing. The soul, apparently, was like a particularly flighty houseguest who might decide to leave permanently if not properly encouraged to stay. This is why medieval people developed the custom of saying "God bless you" after someone sneezed, which wasn't just politeness, but a literal spiritual intervention designed to prevent the soul from making a break for it. But it gets weirder. The direction you sneezed mattered enormously. Sneezing to the right was considered lucky. Sneezing to the left was ominous, and sneezing straight ahead was apparently the supernatural equivalent of a shrug, neither particularly good nor bad, just cosmically neutral. Medieval people would actually try to control the direction of their sneezes, which, if you've ever attempted this, you'll know is roughly as effective as trying to control the direction of a volcanic eruption. There were also very specific times when sneezing was particularly dangerous. Sneezing during prayers was considered so bad that some churches actually had designated sneeze watchers, whose job was to monitor the congregation for wayward nasal emissions and immediately begin damage control prayers. Sneezing while eating was thought to invite demons to join you for dinner, which explains why medieval dining was often such a tense affair, everyone trying to eat without making any sudden respiratory movements. And then there was the matter of sneezing frequency. One sneeze was generally considered acceptable, even potentially lucky. 2 sneezes in a row meant you were probably coming down with something, but also that good news was on the way. 3 sneezes, however, was a sign that someone was talking about you behind your back, which, in a medieval village where everyone knew everyone else's business, was probably just statistically likely rather than supernatural. But 4 sneezes? 4 sneezes meant death. Not immediately, but soon. Medieval people were so convinced of this that there are recorded cases of people who sneezed 4 times in a row, immediately making their wills and preparing for the afterlife. The fact that most of them went on to live perfectly normal lives did nothing to shake this belief. Clearly they reasoned their immediate preparations for death had somehow appeased whatever cosmic force had been targeting them. The medical establishment of the time, such as it was, had their own theories about sneezing. They believed it was caused by an excess of hot, moist air in the brain, which sounds almost scientific until you realize they thought the solution was to balance this by eating cold, dry foods like crackers and drinking wine. Medieval physicians essentially prescribed a medieval equivalent of a cocktail party as medical treatment, which honestly sounds more pleasant than most modern medical interventions. Some regions developed even more elaborate sneeze-related superstitions. In parts of France, it was believed that if you sneezed while putting on your left shoe, you would have bad luck all day. But if you sneezed while putting on your right shoe, you would find money before sunset. This led to people deliberately lingering over the shoe putting on process, hoping to time their sneezes correctly, which probably looked exactly as ridiculous as it sounds. The church, naturally, had mixed feelings about sneeze superstitions. On one hand, saying "God bless you" was clearly a good Christian response that acknowledged God's power over bodily functions. On the other hand, the elaborate rituals and directional theories seemed dangerously close to paganism, church authorities tried to strike a balance by encouraging the God bless you response, while discouraging the more exotic beliefs, with roughly the same success rate as trying to discourage people from talking about the weather. But perhaps the most telling aspect of medieval sneeze superstitions was how they reflected the broader medieval anxiety about bodily control. In a world where people had very little understanding of how their own bodies worked, every unexpected bodily function felt potentially supernatural. Sneezing, burping, hiccuping, all of these were seen as moments when the spiritual and physical worlds intersected, usually with unpredictable and potentially dangerous results. This fear of bodily unpredictability extended to other involuntary functions as well. Yawning was thought to let evil spirits enter the body, which is why medieval people would cover their mouths and make the sign of the cross when they yawned. Hiccups were considered a sign that someone was lying about you, and the only way to stop them was to guess who was spreading the falsehood and confront them directly, a belief that probably led to some very awkward social situations. The medieval world was one where your own body was potentially your enemy, where normal human functions were fraught with spiritual significance, and where something as simple as a sneeze could trigger a cascade of supernatural consequences that might determine your fate for days or even years to come. It was a world where people lived in constant negotiation with forces they couldn't see, understand, or control, using rituals and beliefs that provided the illusion of safety in a universe that seemed determined to kill them in increasingly creative ways. Now, if sneezing was a spiritual crisis, imagine how medieval people felt about mirrors. In the modern world, mirrors are useful objects that occasionally deliver unfortunate truths about our appearance and sometimes make us wonder if we should invest in better lighting. In medieval Europe, mirrors were essentially portals to hell, staffed by demons with nothing better to do than steal souls and cause domestic havoc. The medieval relationship with mirrors was complicated from the start because, for most of the period, mirrors weren't the clear silvered glass we know today. Early medieval mirrors were polished metal, usually bronze or silver, that gave murky, distorted reflections that probably did look somewhat supernatural. The images they produced were vague, shadowy, and had a tendency to flicker in candlelight, which would unnerve anyone, let alone people who already believed the world was crawling with invisible, malevolent entities. But even when glass mirrors began appearing in the later medieval period, the superstitions only intensified. Medieval people believed that mirrors didn't just show your reflection, they captured a piece of your soul. Every time you looked in a mirror, you were literally giving away a small portion of your spiritual essence, which was stored somewhere behind the glass, like a supernatural savings account managed by forces you definitely didn't want to owe money to. This belief led to the development of mirror etiquette that was more complex than modern diplomatic protocol. You couldn't just casually glance at your reflection whenever you felt like it. Looking in a mirror required spiritual preparation, ideally including prayers for protection and a careful consideration of whether seeing your reflection was worth the potential soul cost. Some people would actually fast before looking in mirrors, reasoning that a purified soul was less likely to be successfully captured by whatever entities lived behind the glass. Breaking a mirror, naturally, was an absolute catastrophe. The 7 years of bad luck belief didn't originate in medieval times, but medieval people had their own, arguably worse theories about mirror breakage. They believed that breaking a mirror released all the soul fragments that had been trapped inside, but not back to their original owners. Instead, these spiritual bits would be scattered to the winds, potentially ending up attached to random strangers, animals, or worst of all, demons who could use them to curse you from a distance. The cleanup process for broken mirrors was therefore incredibly elaborate. The pieces couldn't just be swept up and thrown away. That would be like carelessly disposing of radioactive material. Instead, every shard had to be carefully collected while wearing gloves. to prevent the glass fragments from stealing soul bits through skin contact, and then buried in consecrated ground, preferably during daylight hours when evil spirits were presumably taking their lunch break. Some communities develop mirror disposal specialists, essentially medieval hazmat workers, who would come to your house after a mirror-breaking incident and perform the proper spiritual cleanup procedures. These specialists would often spend hours searching for tiny glass fragments, accompanied by priests who would perform continuous blessing rituals to prevent any escaped soul fragments from being claimed by unauthorized supernatural entities. But the mirror superstitions didn't stop at soul theft. Medieval people also believed that demons use mirrors as monitoring devices, essentially supernatural security cameras that allowed hellish authorities to spy on human activities. This belief led to the practice of covering mirrors during certain activities, prayers, eating, sleeping, and especially any kind of intimate relations, which medieval people were already convinced were probably sinful even within marriage. The bedroom mirror was considered particularly dangerous because it was believed that demons were most active at night, and that sleeping in view of a mirror was essentially an invitation for evil spirits to watch you at your most vulnerable. Some medieval bedrooms had elaborate curtain systems designed to cover mirrors after dark, operated by pulleys and ropes that probably took longer to set up than actually getting ready for bed. Mirrors were also thought to be connected to other mirrors through some kind of supernatural network. Medieval people believed that if you stared into a mirror long enough, especially at night, you might see reflections of distant places or even the future. This sounds almost romantic until you realize they thought this was a terrible thing that would either drive you insane or provide forbidden knowledge that would damn your soul. Medieval people wanted to know the future about as much as modern people want to receive spoilers for their favorite TV shows. This led to strict rules about nighttime mirror usage. Looking in a mirror by candlelight was considered extremely dangerous because the flickering flames would supposedly activate the mirror's supernatural properties. Some regions banned mirror usage entirely after sunset, and mirror-equipped households would employ servants whose specific job was to ensure all mirrors were properly covered before dark and uncovered after sunrise. The church's position on mirrors was typically complex. Church authorities couldn't exactly ban mirrors entirely because they were useful and increasingly common, but they were deeply suspicious of anything that seemed to involve supernatural forces outside Christian control. They developed a compromise position that mirrors were acceptable for practical grooming purposes, but warned against vain contemplation of one's reflection, which was believed to invite demonic influence through the sin of vanity. This created a bizarre situation where medieval people would use mirrors for practical purposes, while simultaneously being terrified of them. They would quickly check their appearance while muttering protective prayers, trying to minimize their exposure to potential soul theft while still maintaining basic hygiene. It was like having a useful household appliance that you also suspected might be plotting your spiritual destruction. Some wealthy medieval households actually employed mirror attendants, servants whose job was to hold mirrors for their employers, while providing continuous prayers and spiritual protection during the reflection viewing process. These attendants were essentially human spiritual firewalls, standing between their employers and the potentially malevolent forces that lived behind the glass. The truly paranoid went even further and used mirror substitutes, polished stones or bowls of water, reasoning that these natural reflective surfaces were less likely to be infiltrated by demons than artificial mirrors. This led to some very awkward grooming situations, as people tried to style their hair using the reflection in a bowl of water, while someone else held it steady and recited protective incantations. Medieval mirror superstitions reveal a deep anxiety about self-knowledge and vanity, but also about the porousness of the spiritual world. To medieval minds, mirrors weren't just tools, they were windows, and windows could be opened from either side. Every reflection was a potential invasion, every glance a possible theft, every broken mirror a spiritual catastrophe that could echo through generations. If mirrors were portals to hell, then cats were basically four-legged ambassadors from the underworld who had somehow convinced humans to feed them and clean their litter boxes. Medieval Europe's relationship with cats was one of the most tragically absurd chapters in the long history of human-animal relations, a story that perfectly encapsulates how superstition could transform useful, harmless creatures into instruments of cosmic terror. The medieval cat situation started innocently enough. Cats were actually quite useful in medieval society. They caught rats and mice that would otherwise eat stored grain and spread disease. Early medieval communities generally appreciated cats for their practical rodent control services. But then the church got involved, and things went spectacularly downhill from there. The problem began with the medieval Christian obsession with dualism, the belief that everything in the world was either aligned with God or with Satan, with no neutral ground in between. Cats, with their independent nature, nocturnal habits, and unsettling ability to see in the dark, were gradually placed in the probably demonic category. The fact that cats couldn't be trained to obey commands like dogs was seen not as evidence of natural feline independence, but as proof that they were spiritually aligned with forces of chaos and rebellion. Medieval people developed an elaborate mythology around cats that would be hilarious if it hadn't led to centuries of feline persecution. They believed that cats were witches' familiars, supernatural assistants who helped sorceresses perform evil magic. The logic here was circular and bulletproof. Witches had cats. Cats were therefore evil, and anyone who owned a cat was probably a witch. The fact that cats were useful for pest control was irrelevant compared to their obvious supernatural associations. Black cats, naturally, were considered the most demonic. Medieval people believed that black cats were either demons in disguise or witches who had transformed themselves into feline form. A black cat crossing your path wasn't just bad luck. It was essentially a demonic reconnaissance mission, with the cat reporting back to its supernatural handlers about your daily activities and potential vulnerabilities. But the superstitions didn't stop with black cats. Cats of any colour were suspected of supernatural abilities. Medieval people believed that cats could steal your breath while you slept, literally sucking the life force out of sleeping humans. This belief was so widespread that many medieval households banned cats from bedrooms entirely, and parents would keep armed vigil over sleeping children if there was a cat anywhere in the vicinity. The breath-stealing belief was particularly persistent because it seemed to have observational evidence. Cats do like to sleep near warm humans, and they sometimes do sleep on people's chests. Medieval people interpreted this normal feline behaviour as attempted murder through respiratory theft. The fact that people generally woke up unharmed after sleeping near cats was explained by saying that the cats had been interrupted in their murderous intentions, or that the victims had been protected by prayers or lucky charms. Cats were also believed to be able to see demons and evil spirits invisible to human eyes. This wasn't considered a useful early warning system, quite the opposite. Medieval people thought that cats' ability to see supernatural entities proved that they were allied with these forces. If your cat stared intently at an empty corner of the room, it wasn't because there was nothing there. It was because there was something terrible there that only cats and other evil creatures could perceive. This led to the disturbing practice of cat behaviour interpretation. Medieval people would watch their cats obsessively, trying to decode their supernatural communications. A cat washing its face was believed to be a sign that visitors were coming, but not necessarily welcome ones. A cat sitting with its back to the fire was supposedly summoning evil spirits. A cat that refused to enter a particular room was either protecting the humans from something terrible or planning something terrible itself. Medieval people were never quite sure which. The church's official position on cats was complex and evolved over time, but generally unhelpful to feline welfare. While early church authorities didn't specifically condemn cats, they were deeply suspicious of any animal associated with paganism or folk magic. As witch persecution intensified during the later medieval period, cats became guilty by association. Pope Gregory IX's papal bull of 1233, while not specifically targeting cats, described devil worship ceremonies that featured cat-like demons, which medieval people interpreted as official church confirmation that cats were demonic. This papal endorsement of cat suspicion led to some of the most absurd episodes in medieval religious history. Some communities organized cat trials, where cats accused of witchcraft would be formally prosecuted in courts of law. These trials featured human lawyers arguing about feline supernatural activities, witnesses testifying about suspicious cat behavior, and judges solemnly determining whether specific cats were guilty of demonic collaboration. The punishments for convicted cats were as elaborate as they were cruel. Cat execution methods included drowning, burning, and being thrown from high towers. The last method being particularly popular because medieval people believed that cats' alleged supernatural powers would protect them from injury if they were innocent. The fact that cats occasionally did survive falls from significant heights was taken as proof that the supernatural trial system was working, rather than evidence of basic feline anatomy and physics. Some communities developed annual cat persecution festivals, where hundreds of cats would be rounded up and killed in elaborate public ceremonies designed to protect the community from supernatural threats. These events were often timed to coincide with religious holidays, creating the bizarre spectacle of Christians celebrating the birth of Christ by massacring domestic animals they believed were allied with Satan. The economic effects of medieval cat persecution were predictably disastrous. Communities that successfully eliminated their cat populations soon found themselves overrun with rats and mice, leading to crop destruction and disease outbreaks. But rather than recognizing the practical value of cats, medieval people interpreted the subsequent rodent infestations as proof that the cats had been calling their supernatural allies for revenge from beyond the grave. Some medieval people tried to have it both ways by keeping cats for pest control while simultaneously performing elaborate protection rituals to guard against their pets' supposed supernatural malevolence. These households would bless their cats daily, force them to wear religious medallions, and keep holy water available for emergency cat blessing situations. Living with a medieval cat was apparently like sharing your home with a useful but potentially demonic roommate who required constant spiritual surveillance. The tragedy of medieval cat persecution is that it reveals how superstition could override practical evidence. Even as communities suffered from rodent-borne diseases and crop destruction, the belief in feline supernatural danger was so strong that many people preferred to live with rats rather than cats. It was a perfect example of how collective belief could create a reality so powerful that people would literally choose suffering over abandoning their superstitions. Medieval cats lived in a world where their natural behaviors, independence, nocturnal activity, hunting skills were interpreted as evidence of demonic allegiance. They were useful creatures transformed by human imagination into supernatural threats, victims of a worldview that couldn't allow anything to be simply what it appeared to be. In a universe where everything had to be either holy or evil, cats had the misfortune of being too mysterious for their own good. While cats were dealing with accusations of demonic collaboration, medieval people were also busy developing elaborate theories about one of humanity's most basic activities, sleeping. In the modern world, sleep is understood as a biological necessity that sometimes involves weird dreams and morning breath. In medieval Europe, sleep was essentially a nightly journey into supernatural territory, fraught with spiritual dangers and requiring extensive protective measures. Medieval people believed that sleep was the soul's temporary departure from the body, a kind of trial run for death that left the physical form vulnerable to supernatural invasion, while the soul was off doing whatever souls do during sleep, presumably attending spiritual meetings or reviewing the day's sins. The empty body was like an unlocked house in a neighborhood full of demons, evil spirits, and miscellaneous supernatural troublemakers looking for temporary accommodations. This belief led to the development of bedtime rituals that were more complex than modern space shuttle launch procedures. Going to sleep wasn't simply a matter of lying down and closing your eyes. It required spiritual preparation, protective positioning, and careful attention to supernatural safety protocols that had been developed over generations of trial and error, mostly error. The bedroom itself had to be properly arranged to prevent supernatural intrusion. Beds were positioned to avoid certain directions. Sleeping with your head to the north was considered particularly dangerous because that was the direction associated with death and evil spirits. Some regions insisted that beds should face east, toward the rising sun and the direction of Jerusalem, while others maintained that south was safer because it was associated with warmth and life. The position you slept in was equally important. Sleeping on your back was considered risky because it left you open to demonic influence. The soul could more easily escape through the mouth, and evil spirits could more easily enter through the same route. Sleeping on your left side was thought to cause nightmares because the heart was closer to the ground, making it more accessible to underground demons. The right side was generally considered safer, though this led to entire populations of people forcing themselves to sleep in specific positions, which probably resulted in a lot of medieval insomnia. Medieval people also believed that dreams were not simply random brain activity during sleep, but actual experiences of the soul during its temporary absence from the body. This meant that dream content had to be carefully analysed for supernatural significance. Dreaming about animals, particularly black animals, was considered a bad omen. Dreaming about dead relatives was thought to be actual visitations from beyond the grave, requiring immediate prayers for the souls of the deceased. But the most dangerous dreams were those that seemed too vivid or too pleasant. Medieval people believed that demons could create false dreams to tempt humans into sin or to provide forbidden knowledge about the future. If you woke up from a particularly enjoyable dream, the recommended response was immediate prayer and possibly fasting to cleanse yourself of any demonic influence you might have absorbed during your sleep-time supernatural encounters. This led to the practice of dream confession, where people would report their dreams to priests for spiritual analysis. Medieval confessionals regularly featured discussions of dream content, with church authorities trying to determine whether specific dreams represented divine communication, demonic temptation, or simply the result of eating too much cheese before bedtime. The fact that diet could affect dream content was actually recognized by medieval medicine, but they thought the mechanism involved supernatural forces rather than simple digestion. The protection strategies for safe sleeping were elaborate and varied by region. Some medieval people slept with blessed salt sprinkled around their beds, reasoning that evil spirits were allergic to consecrated minerals. Others kept iron objects under their pillows, believing that demons couldn't tolerate the presence of cold iron. Garlic was popular in some areas, though this was more for protection against vampires than general supernatural threats. Religious imagery was considered essential for bedroom protection. Crucifixes, holy medals, and religious paintings were strategically placed around sleeping areas to create protective barriers against supernatural intrusion. Some medieval bedrooms resembled small chapels, with religious artifacts covering every available surface. The idea was to create such a thoroughly Christian environment that demons and evil spirits would feel too uncomfortable to enter, like supernatural beings with strong religious allergies. But perhaps the most widespread protective practice was bedtime prayer, and not just any prayer. Specific anti-demon prayers that had to be recited in the correct order while performing the appropriate physical gestures. These prayers were essentially spiritual security systems, designed to lock down the soul's connection to the body and prevent unauthorized supernatural access during sleep. Some communities developed group sleeping practices, designed to provide supernatural protection through numbers. Extended families would sleep in the same room, reasoning that demons would be less likely to attack multiple people simultaneously. This practice also allowed for supernatural surveillance. If one person began showing signs of demonic possession during sleep, others could intervene with emergency prayers and holy water. The most paranoid medieval sleepers employed wake watchers, people whose job was to stay awake and monitor sleeping individuals for signs of supernatural interference. These watchers would look for unusual movements, strange sounds, or changes in breathing that might indicate demonic activity. If anything suspicious was observed, the watchers would immediately wake the sleeper and begin emergency spiritual cleansing procedures. Morning wake-up routines were equally important as bedtime preparations. Medieval people believed that the moment of waking was particularly dangerous because the soul was returning to the body, and evil spirits might try to enter during the transition. The first thing you were supposed to do upon waking was make the sign of the cross and recite a prayer of thanks for surviving another night of supernatural vulnerability. Some medieval people kept dream journals, not for psychological analysis, but for supernatural record keeping. These journals were essentially logbooks of nightly spiritual adventures, documenting encounters with dead relatives, visits from angels or demons, and prophetic visions that might provide useful information about the future. These dream records were sometimes consulted by local priests or wise women for community guidance, turning individual sleep experiences into collective supernatural intelligence. The medieval approach to sleep reveals the profound anxiety that characterized daily life in a world where people believed they were constantly surrounded by invisible threats. Sleep, which should have been a refuge from the dangers and anxieties of medieval life, instead became another battlefield in the ongoing war between human souls and supernatural forces. Medieval people went to bed each night knowing that they were about to embark on a journey into territory controlled by entities that wished them harm, and they developed elaborate defensive strategies for what should have been the most natural and peaceful human activity. It was a worldview that turned rest into vigilance, dreams into spiritual warfare, and bedtime into a complex negotiation with forces beyond human understanding. Medieval people lived their entire lives in a state of supernatural siege, and sleep was simply another front in a war they could never win, only survive one night at a time. If sleeping was fraught with supernatural peril, then eating was essentially Russian roulette with invisible forces, where every meal could be your last if you violated the wrong mystical dining rule. Medieval people developed food superstitions that were so elaborate and contradictory that simply getting through dinner without accidentally summoning demons or cursing your family required more strategic planning than most modern military operations. The medieval relationship with food was complicated by the fact that people were often hungry, which made every meal precious, but also potentially dangerous. Food scarcity meant that wasting food was not just economically devastating, but also spiritually suspect. God had provided sustenance, and failing to properly respect that provision might result in divine punishment, which usually manifested as even more hunger. But respecting food properly required navigating a maze of supernatural dining protocols that would challenge even the most devout medieval Christian. The direction you faced while eating mattered enormously. Eating while facing east was considered blessed because that was the direction of Jerusalem and the rising sun. Eating while facing north was dangerous because that was the direction associated with death and evil. Some regions insisted that you should never eat while facing west because that was where the sun died each day, making it spiritually contaminated. The order in which you consumed your food was equally critical. Bread had to be eaten first because it was blessed and would provide spiritual protection for the rest of the meal. Meat had to be consumed before vegetables because animals had souls and vegetables didn't, making meat consumption a more spiritually significant act that required proper precedence. Some communities insisted that you had to take exactly 3 bites of bread before touching anything else, while others maintained that 5 bites were necessary for proper spiritual protection. Salt was considered so supernaturally significant that spilling it was essentially a minor apocalypse that required immediate intervention. Spilled salt was believed to attract demons, who apparently had very specific mineral cravings, and would flock to any available sodium chloride like supernatural moths to a crystalline flame. The response to spilled salt had to be swift and precise. You had to immediately throw a pinch of salt over your left shoulder, directly into the face of the demon who was presumably lurking there waiting for his salty snack. But salt superstitions went far beyond simple spilling protocols. The way you passed salt at the table could determine your family's fortune for the coming year. You had to pass salt directly to the person requesting it. Setting it down for them to pick up was considered unlucky and might result in the breakdown of your relationship with that person. Some regions insisted that salt could only be passed with the right hand, while others maintained that using your left hand was acceptable, as long as you made the sign of the cross afterward. Bread had its own complex supernatural rules that reflected its central role in both medieval diet and Christian symbolism. Cutting bread incorrectly could bring 7 years of hunger to your household. The proper method involved making the sign of the cross on the bottom of the loaf before cutting, then cutting only what you intended to eat immediately. Leaving partially cut loaves sitting around was believed to invite demons to contaminate the remaining bread, turning a holy substance into a tool of supernatural corruption. The way bread was stored was equally important. Bread had to be kept right side up. Storing bread upside down was thought to reverse God's blessing and turn your household's fortune from prosperity to poverty. Some medieval households employed bread watchers, usually children, whose job was to monitor stored bread for signs of supernatural interference and ensure that all loaves maintained proper spiritual orientation. Medieval people also believed that certain foods were inherently dangerous during specific times or circumstances. Eating beans during thunderstorms was considered extremely risky because beans were associated with the souls of the dead, and storms were when spirits were most active. Consuming bean-based meals during bad weather was essentially inviting dead relatives to join you for dinner, which sounds pleasant until you realize that medieval people thought this would result in ghostly possession or supernatural digestive problems. Eggs were another source of supernatural anxiety. The way you cracked an eggshell determined the spiritual implications of your meal. If you cracked an egg cleanly, it was considered a good omen for the day ahead. If the shell shattered into multiple pieces, it was a sign of coming misfortune. But the real danger was leaving eggshells intact after eating the contents. Whole eggshells were believed to be perfect vessels for demons, who would move in and use them as supernatural headquarters for planning attacks on your household. This led to the practice of eggshell destruction, where medieval diners would carefully crush every piece of shell immediately after eating eggs. Some communities developed specialized eggshell crushing tools, essentially medieval supernatural safety equipment designed to prevent demonic real estate transactions in your kitchen. The crushing had to be thorough. Leaving even small shell fragments intact could provide demons with supernatural condominiums. Milk presented its own set of supernatural challenges. Fresh milk was considered blessed, but milk that had soured was thought to be cursed, usually by neighbors with evil intentions. Medieval people believed that milk could be magically contaminated from a distance. A jealous neighbor could curse your cow simply by looking at it with malicious intent. This belief led to elaborate cow protection rituals, including blessed amulets tied around cows' necks and prayers recited during milking. But the most complex food superstitions surrounded meat consumption, which was already spiritually complicated due to medieval Christian attitudes about killing animals. The way meat was prepared could determine whether you were honoring God's provision or accidentally participating in demonic rituals. Meat had to be thoroughly cooked. Eating undercooked meat was believed to allow the animal's soul to escape into your body, potentially leading to supernatural possession by confused livestock spirits. The timing of meat consumption was also critical. Eating meat on certain holy days was forbidden, but accidentally consuming meat during prohibited times wasn't just a sin. It was believed to transform the meat into a supernatural poison that would contaminate your soul. Some medieval people became so anxious about accidental meat consumption that they would fast entirely during complex religious calendar periods, rather than risk spiritual contamination through dietary confusion. Medieval dining also featured elaborate guest protocols designed to prevent supernatural infiltration through hospitality. Strangers had to be fed, because turning away hungry travelers might anger God. But feeding strangers also posed the risk of accidentally hosting demons in disguise. The solution was complex guest screening that involved observing whether visitors could consume blessed bread without showing signs of supernatural discomfort. The most paranoid medieval households maintained special demon detection menus, meals that included enough holy elements that any supernatural entities would be forced to reveal their true nature through adverse reactions to consecrated food. These meals featured blessed bread, holy water, mixed into drinks, and meat from animals that had been specifically blessed by priests before slaughter. Perhaps most tellingly, medieval people developed elaborate food blessing rituals that had to be performed before every meal. These weren't simple grace prayers, but complex supernatural security protocols that involve specific hand gestures, precise verbal formulas, and careful attention to the spiritual status of every ingredient. A typical medieval family dinner required more ritual preparation than most modern religious services. The result was a dining culture where every meal was a potential spiritual crisis, every bite a negotiation with invisible forces, and every kitchen a battlefield in the ongoing war between human sustenance and supernatural malevolence. Medieval people couldn't simply eat. They had to eat strategically, defensively, and with constant awareness that their next meal might accidentally damn their souls or invite demons to move into their pantry. If food was a minefield of supernatural danger, then clothing was essentially a form of spiritual armor that could either protect you from evil or accidentally advertise your availability for demonic recruitment. Medieval people believed that what you wore didn't just affect how you looked, it determined your spiritual standing, your social relationships, and your susceptibility to supernatural attack. The colour of your clothing was perhaps the most critical factor in medieval supernatural fashion. Red was considered particularly dangerous because it was associated with blood, passion, and the devil himself. Wearing red clothing was thought to attract demons and evil spirits, who were apparently drawn to crimson like supernatural bulls to a mystical matador. This belief was so strong that many communities actually banned red clothing entirely, except for certain religious officials who were presumably protected by their holy status and extensive prayers. But the red clothing ban created practical problems, because red dye was often the most available and affordable option for medieval textile workers. This led to complex negotiations between practical necessity and supernatural safety, with some communities developing elaborate blessing rituals for red garments that were supposed to neutralize their demonic magnetism. These blessing ceremonies involved priests, holy water, and extended prayers that essentially performed supernatural dry cleaning on potentially cursed clothing. Black clothing presented different but equally serious supernatural risks. While black was associated with mourning and solemnity, it was also believed to be the preferred colour of witches and demon worshippers. Wearing too much black was thought to signal your availability for recruitment by dark supernatural forces. Medieval people had to carefully balance the spiritual benefits of modest, somber clothing with the risk of accidentally advertising themselves as potential candidates for supernatural corruption. The solution was complex black clothing protocols that involved mixing black garments with other colours, adding religious symbols to black clothes, and limiting the amount of black clothing worn at any one time. Some communities developed black clothing quotas. You could wear one black item, but adding a second black garment required special spiritual precautions, and wearing 3 or more black items simultaneously was essentially considered supernatural recklessness. Green clothing was problematic for entirely different reasons. Green was associated with fairies, forest spirits, and other supernatural entities, that weren't necessarily evil, but definitely weren't Christian. Wearing green was thought to attract the attention of fairy folk, who might decide to play pranks on you, steal your belongings, or worse, invite you to join their supernatural communities in the forest, never to return to human society. This belief was particularly strong in regions near forests, where people were already nervous about supernatural woodland inhabitants. Green clothing was often banned entirely in forest communities, while other areas developed green-wearing protocols that involve carrying iron objects to repel fairy attention and reciting specific prayers designed to signal that you were wearing green for practical reasons rather than as an invitation to supernatural social interaction. White clothing was generally considered safe and spiritually pure, but it came with its own set of supernatural complications. White garments had to be kept absolutely clean, because any stain or discoloration was thought to represent spiritual contamination that could spread to the wearer's soul. This created enormous practical problems for medieval people, who lived in a world where staying clean was already nearly impossible due to limited washing facilities and the general mud-covered nature of medieval existence. The result was that white clothing became a kind of spiritual luxury that only the very wealthy or very holy could afford to maintain. Ordinary medieval people who wanted the spiritual protection of white garments often settled for white undergarments that could be hidden beneath more practical outer clothing, creating a hidden layer of supernatural armor that couldn't be easily contaminated by daily life. The way clothing was put on was almost as important as the clothing itself. Medieval people believed that putting on clothes in the wrong order could disrupt your spiritual protection for the entire day. Undergarments had to be put on first, not just for practical reasons, but because they formed the foundation layer of your supernatural defenses. Putting on outer clothing before undergarments was thought to create spiritual vulnerabilities that demons could exploit. The left-right sequence was equally critical. Medieval people had to put on their right shoe before their left shoe, right sleeve before left sleeve, and generally dress the right side of their body before the left side. The logic here was that the right side was associated with righteousness and divine protection, while the left side was connected to evil and supernatural danger. Dressing your evil side first was essentially giving demons a head start in their daily attempts to corrupt your soul. Some medieval communities developed clothing blessing rituals that had to be performed on new garments before they could be safely worn. These ceremonies involved priests examining clothing for supernatural contamination, sprinkling garments with holy water, and reciting prayers that essentially performed spiritual quality control on medieval fashion. New clothes couldn't just be purchased and worn, they had to be spiritually certified for safety. The seasonal timing of clothing changes was also supernaturally significant. Switching from winter to summer clothing had to be done on specific days that were considered spiritually appropriate for wardrobe transitions. Changing clothes on the wrong day was thought to disrupt the natural order and potentially attract the attention of supernatural forces, who were apparently very concerned about proper seasonal fashion timing. Medieval people also believed that clothing could absorb supernatural influences from their surroundings. Garments worn in churches would gradually accumulate holy protection, while clothes worn in forests or other potentially supernatural locations might become contaminated with evil influences. This led to the practice of clothing rotation, where people would deliberately wear their most spiritually protected garments during dangerous activities and save their potentially contaminated clothes for low-risk situations. The concept of cursed clothing was particularly terrifying to medieval minds. They believed that malicious neighbors could place curses on clothing, either by touching garments while thinking evil thoughts, or by performing specific rituals designed to contaminate your wardrobe. Cursed clothing was thought to cause everything from persistent itching to serious illness to supernatural possession. This led to defensive clothing storage practices that resembled supernatural security systems. Clothes had to be stored in blessed containers, protected by religious medallions, and monitored for signs of supernatural interference. Some medieval households employed clothing watchers, usually older women with experience in supernatural detection, whose job was to inspect family wardrobes for evidence of mystical contamination. The most paranoid medieval people developed clothing testing rituals that involved animals. They would let cats or dogs sniff new garments, reasoning that animals could detect supernatural contamination that humans might miss. If an animal showed reluctance to approach clothing, it was considered evidence of supernatural danger, and the garment would be subjected to intensive spiritual cleansing or simply destroyed. Medieval clothing superstitions reveal how deeply spiritual anxiety penetrated every aspect of daily life. Getting dressed wasn't just a practical necessity, it was a daily ritual that required careful attention to supernatural protocols, colour symbolism, and mystical timing. Medieval people couldn't simply throw on clothes and go about their business. They had to dress defensively, strategically, and with constant awareness that their fashion choices could determine their spiritual fate. It was a world where your outfit could accidentally damn your soul, where the wrong colour combination could attract demons, and where getting dressed required more spiritual preparation than most modern people invest in their most important life decisions. Medieval wardrobes weren't just collections of clothing, they were arsenals in the ongoing battle between human souls and supernatural forces, carefully curated for maximum spiritual protection and minimum demonic appeal. But if medieval people thought their clothing choices were spiritually dangerous, they were absolutely terrified of what happened when those clothes came off. Bathing in medieval Europe wasn't just rare due to practical limitations, it was considered supernaturally risky, potentially exposing bathers to demonic influence, spiritual contamination, and a host of supernatural threats that allegedly found naked humans irresistibly vulnerable. The medieval fear of bathing was rooted in several converging beliefs that created a perfect storm of supernatural anxiety around personal hygiene. First, medieval people believed that removing all your clothes eliminated your spiritual defenses, leaving you as vulnerable to demonic attack as a medieval castle with all its walls removed. Clothing wasn't just practical protection, it was supernatural armor, and taking it off was essentially spiritual disarmament. Second, water itself was considered spiritually ambiguous. While holy water was blessed and protective, ordinary water was thought to be a potential hiding place for evil spirits, demons, and other supernatural entities that enjoyed lurking in liquid environments. Immersing yourself in water was essentially entering enemy territory, where you could be attacked by aquatic demons or possessed by spirits that lived in wells, rivers, and even domestic water containers. The temperature of bath water added another layer of supernatural complexity. Hot water was associated with hell and demonic influence. Taking hot baths was thought to replicate the conditions of eternal damnation and potentially attract the attention of demons who felt comfortable in heated environments. Cold water, while not demonic, was believed to shock the soul and potentially cause it to separate from the body, leaving bathers vulnerable to spiritual theft by opportunistic evil entities. Medieval people developed elaborate bathing protocols designed to minimize supernatural risks, while still achieving some level of cleanliness. These protocols involve specific timing, protective prayers, and careful attention to spiritual safety measures that made bathing more complex than modern space shuttle maintenance procedures. The timing of baths was critical. Bathing during certain phases of the moon was considered particularly dangerous because supernatural forces were believed to be more active during lunar transitions. Full moon bathing was thought to attract werewolves and other shape-shifting entities, while new moon bathing could allegedly summon demons who preferred the cover of darkness. Seasonal timing was equally important. Spring bathing was generally considered safe because it aligned with natural renewal and spiritual rebirth. Summer bathing was risky due to the increased activity of supernatural forces during warm weather. Fall bathing was thought to invite evil spirits who were gathering strength for winter. while winter bathing was considered nearly suicidal because it exposed vulnerable humans to supernatural entities that thrived in cold, dark conditions. The location of bathing was perhaps the most critical factor in medieval hygiene safety protocols. Bathing indoors was generally preferred because domestic spaces could be blessed and protected with religious imagery, but indoor bathing required extensive spiritual preparation of the bathing area. The room had to be blessed by a priest, protected with holy water, and equipped with religious symbols that would discourage demonic intrusion. Outdoor bathing was considered extremely dangerous because natural water sources were believed to be populated by supernatural entities that resented human intrusion. Rivers and lakes were thought to be home to water spirits, demons, and other creatures that would attack vulnerable bathers. Even wells, which were essential for daily life, were considered supernaturally risky for bathing because they connected the surface world to underground realms where evil spirits allegedly congregated. The most paranoid medieval communities developed group bathing protocols designed to provide supernatural protection through numbers. The theory was that demons would be less likely to attack multiple naked humans simultaneously, either because of the logistical challenges or because group spiritual energy would create protective barriers against supernatural assault. These group bathing sessions resembled religious ceremonies more than hygiene activities. Participants would recite prayers throughout the bathing process, maintain constant vigilance for signs of supernatural interference, and be prepared to immediately evacuate the water if anyone showed symptoms of demonic possession or spiritual attack. Medieval people also believed that certain substances could provide supernatural protection during bathing. Salt was commonly added to bath water because it was thought to repel demons and evil spirits. Blessed herbs were sometimes included for additional spiritual protection, while some communities insisted on adding holy water to regular bath water to create a spiritually safe bathing environment. The soap situation was particularly complex because soap making often involved ingredients that were considered supernaturally ambiguous. Animal fats used in soap production could carry spiritual contamination from the animals, while plant-based soap ingredients might attract forest spirits or other nature-based supernatural entities. Some medieval communities developed blessed soap-making processes that involved priests' prayers and careful spiritual oversight of soap production. Perhaps most tellingly, medieval people developed alternative cleaning methods that avoided the supernatural risks of full-body bathing. These included partial washing of hands and face, which was considered less spiritually dangerous than total immersion, and the use of dry cleaning methods that involved herbs, powders, and careful grooming without water contact. The medieval approach to personal hygiene reveals the profound impact of supernatural beliefs on even the most basic human activities. Staying clean wasn't just a matter of health and social acceptability. It was a complex negotiation with invisible forces that were believed to monitor human vulnerability and exploit opportunities for spiritual attack. Medieval people lived in a world where basic hygiene was not only practically difficult, but supernaturally dangerous, where staying clean required courage as much as soap, and where the choice between cleanliness and safety often favored safety. It was a civilization that literally chose to live with dirt rather than risk their souls, creating a society where spiritual protection was more important than physical comfort. The result was a medieval Europe where people were not just physically dirty, but proud of their supernatural caution, where avoiding baths was considered a sign of spiritual wisdom rather than poor hygiene, and where cleanliness was less important than the godliness that could allegedly be lost in a tub of potentially demon-infested water. While medieval people were avoiding baths to protect their souls, they were simultaneously developing elaborate theories about how their souls could be stolen, damaged, or hijacked through activities that modern people consider completely harmless. Medieval Europe was essentially a civilization convinced that their immortal essences were constantly under assault by supernatural forces, with nothing better to do than target random Christians going about their daily business. The medieval understanding of the soul was both more concrete and more vulnerable than modern religious concepts. Medieval people believed that the soul was a tangible spiritual substance that could be physically damaged, stolen in pieces, or contaminated through contact with evil influences. It wasn't an abstract spiritual concept. It was essentially a supernatural organ that required constant care and protection. This belief led to the development of soul protection strategies that would challenge the most paranoid modern security expert. Medieval people believed that the soul could exit the body through various openings: the mouth during yawning, the eyes during excessive crying, and the ears during loud noises. This meant that every bodily function was a potential security breach that required immediate spiritual damage control. Yawning was considered particularly dangerous because it provided demons with a direct access route to the soul. Medieval people would cover their mouths while yawning and immediately make the sign of the cross to prevent supernatural intrusion. Some communities developed yawning protocols that involved specific prayers designed to seal the spiritual breach created by opening your mouth wide enough for demon entry. But the yawning superstitions went beyond simple mouth covering. Medieval people believed that the size of your yawn determined the level of supernatural risk. Small yawns were manageable with basic protective measures, but large yawns required extensive spiritual intervention. Some medieval communities employed yawn watchers, whose job was to monitor community members for dangerous yawning and provide immediate spiritual assistance. Excessive emotional displays were thought to weaken the soul's connection to the body, making it easier for supernatural forces to steal spiritual essence. Crying too much, laughing too loudly, or expressing anger too intensely were all considered forms of spiritual recklessness that could result in partial soul loss. Medieval people had to express emotions carefully, moderately, and with constant attention to their supernatural security. This led to the practice of emotional regulation that was motivated not by psychological health, but by supernatural safety. Medieval communities developed complex guidelines for appropriate emotional expression that were designed to protect souls rather than maintain social harmony. Too much joy was as dangerous as too much sorrow. Both could allegedly loosen the soul's attachment to the body and create opportunities for spiritual theft. The medieval belief in partial soul loss explained a wide range of common human experiences that modern people understand in psychological or medical terms. Feeling tired after emotional stress? Obviously, you had lost part of your soul and needed spiritual restoration. Feeling depressed or listless? Clearly, demons had stolen pieces of your spiritual essence, and you required professional supernatural intervention. This led to the development of soul recovery services provided by medieval spiritual specialists. These practitioners, who operated in the grey area between legitimate church authority and folk magic, offered soul retrieval services that involved complex rituals designed to locate missing soul fragments and restore them to their proper owners. Soul retrieval ceremonies resembled supernatural forensic investigations, with specialists attempting to determine when and how soul theft had occurred, identify the supernatural perpetrators, and negotiate for the return of stolen spiritual property. These ceremonies often involved elaborate prayers, blessed objects, and sometimes direct confrontation with the demons or evil spirits responsible for the theft. Medieval people also believed that souls could be damaged through association with cursed objects, contaminated food, or spiritually polluted locations. This meant that soul maintenance required constant vigilance about your environment, your possessions, and your social contacts. Living in medieval Europe was like being constantly exposed to spiritual radiation that could gradually degrade your immortal essence. The concept of soul contamination was particularly terrifying because it was believed to be contagious. Spending time with people who had damaged or partially stolen souls could result in cross-contamination of your own spiritual essence. This led to social isolation practices, where medieval people would avoid contact with individuals suspected of supernatural compromise. Some medieval communities developed soul testing procedures designed to assess the spiritual integrity of community members. These tests involved observing responses to holy objects, monitoring behavior for signs of supernatural influence, and sometimes direct spiritual examination by qualified religious authorities. It was essentially supernatural quality control for human souls. The most paranoid medieval people employed soul guards, spiritual advisors, whose job was to monitor their clients' supernatural safety and provide immediate intervention if soul theft was detected. These guards would observe their clients' daily activities, assess potential supernatural threats, and maintain constant vigilance for signs of spiritual compromise. Medieval people also believed that souls could be stolen through dreams, which added another layer of complexity to sleep protection strategies. Dream thieves were thought to be specialized supernatural entities who could access sleeping souls and steal spiritual essence, while their victims were unconscious and vulnerable. This led to dream protection rituals that involved blessed objects placed around beds, specific prayers recited before sleep, and sometimes wake watchers whose job was to monitor sleepers for signs of soul theft in progress. The economic impact of medieval soul theft beliefs was significant because soul protection required constant investment in blessed objects, spiritual services, and supernatural insurance policies. Medieval households budgeted for soul maintenance the way modern families budget for health insurance, recognizing that spiritual protection was essential for basic survival in a world full of invisible threats. Perhaps most remarkably, medieval people developed soul theft insurance through religious institutions that offered spiritual protection services in exchange for donations, prayers, and religious devotion. These arrangements were essentially supernatural insurance policies that promised divine intervention if soul theft occurred, creating an economy based on fear of invisible forces that may not have existed. The medieval obsession with soul protection reveals the profound anxiety that characterized daily life in a world where people believed their most essential essence was constantly under attack. Medieval people couldn't simply live their lives. They had to live defensively, strategically, and with constant awareness that their immortal souls were valuable commodities in a supernatural economy where demons and evil spirits were always shopping for spiritual merchandise. It was a civilization where people invested more energy in protecting something they couldn't see than in improving conditions they could directly observe, where supernatural threats were more real than physical dangers, and where the health of invisible souls was more important than the comfort of visible bodies. As medieval superstitions reached their most elaborate and paranoid extremes, European society began to develop institutional responses to supernatural threats that were as organized and systematic as their fears were irrational. The later medieval period witnessed the emergence of professional supernatural specialists, official church policies on demonic activity, and legal systems designed to prosecute crimes that existed primarily in the collective imagination. The rise of professional demon hunters marked a significant evolution in medieval supernatural anxiety. These specialists, who operated with varying degrees of church approval, offered services that ranged from basic supernatural home inspection to complex exorcism procedures designed to remove demonic infestations from households, individuals, and even entire communities. Medieval demon hunters were essentially supernatural exterminators who approached invisible threats with the systematic efficiency of pest control specialists. They developed diagnostic procedures for identifying different types of supernatural infestations, treatment protocols for various categories of demonic activity, and follow-up services designed to prevent re-infestation by expelled evil spirits. The diagnostic procedures were particularly elaborate because medieval people believed that different supernatural entities required different removal techniques. Ordinary demons could allegedly be expelled through basic prayer and holy water application, while more powerful evil spirits required complex exorcism ceremonies involving multiple priests, blessed objects, and sometimes days of continuous spiritual warfare. But the most sophisticated supernatural specialists were those who claimed expertise in curse detection and removal. Medieval people were convinced that many of their problems resulted from curses placed by malicious neighbours, rival families, or professional witches who offered curse services to paying customers. Curse detection became a specialised skill that involved examining potential victims for supernatural symptoms, investigating their recent social interactions for curse placement opportunities, and identifying the specific individuals responsible for mystical attacks. Curse removal was even more complex than curse detection because it often involved countermagic that skirted dangerously close to witchcraft itself. Supernatural specialists had to remove curses without using methods that would make them appear to be practicing forbidden magic, creating elaborate procedures that achieve magical results through supposedly legitimate religious means. The Church's official position on professional supernatural specialists was characteristically complicated. Church authorities recognized that demonic activity was real and dangerous, but they were suspicious of anyone who claimed special expertise in dealing with supernatural threats. This created a grey market of semi-legitimate spiritual services provided by practitioners who operated with uncertain church approval. Some supernatural specialists obtained official church endorsement by emphasizing their use of orthodox religious methods and their submission to clerical authority. These legitimate practitioners offered services that were essentially franchised supernatural solutions, approved by religious authorities and backed by institutional credibility. But many supernatural specialists operated independently, offering services that the Church considered questionable but didn't actively prohibit. These practitioners walked a fine line between helpful spiritual service and suspicious magical activity, providing supernatural solutions while avoiding official condemnation. The most successful supernatural specialists were those who combined legitimate religious authority with practical supernatural effectiveness. Priests who specialized in exorcism, monks who offered curse removal services, and nuns who provided spiritual protection became celebrities in medieval communities that were desperate for professional supernatural assistance. Medieval legal systems also evolved to address supernatural crimes, creating judicial procedures for prosecuting witchcraft, demon summoning, and other forms of supernatural criminality. These legal developments reflected the medieval belief that supernatural activities had real-world consequences that required official response from secular authorities. Witchcraft trials became elaborate legal proceedings that attempted to apply rational judicial procedures to completely irrational supernatural accusations. Medieval courts developed evidence standards for supernatural crimes, witness testimony protocols for mystical activities, and punishment guidelines for various categories of magical criminality. The challenge was that supernatural crimes were, by definition, impossible to prove using normal evidence standards. This led to the development of alternative evidence categories that included supernatural symptoms, mysterious coincidences, and testimony from witnesses who claimed to have observed invisible supernatural activities. Medieval courts also had to develop procedures for dealing with accused supernatural criminals who claimed innocence or denied the existence of supernatural forces. These cases required complex legal reasoning about the relationship between human actions and mystical consequences, creating jurisprudence that attempted to regulate activities that may not have existed. Perhaps most remarkably, medieval legal systems developed punishment guidelines for supernatural crimes that were designed to address both the temporal and eternal consequences of magical activities. Convicted witches and demon summoners faced not only earthly punishment, but also spiritual rehabilitation designed to save their souls from eternal damnation. Some medieval communities developed supernatural crime prevention programs that involved community education about magical threats, surveillance systems for detecting suspicious supernatural activity, and rapid response protocols for addressing mystical emergencies. These programs were essentially medieval homeland security systems designed to protect communities from invisible enemies. The economic impact of institutionalized supernatural anxiety was enormous. Medieval communities invested significant resources in professional supernatural services, legal procedures for mystical crimes, and infrastructure designed to provide protection from invisible threats. The supernatural protection industry became a major component of medieval economy, employing thousands of specialists and consuming resources that might otherwise have been invested in practical improvements. Medieval record-keeping systems also evolved to track supernatural activities, creating archives of demonic encounters, databases of curse incidents, and genealogical records designed to identify families with histories of supernatural involvement. These records were essentially medieval intelligence files on invisible threats, maintained by religious and secular authorities who believed that proper documentation was essential for effective supernatural defense. The institutionalization of medieval superstition reveals how collective belief could create entire economic and social systems based on managing threats that existed primarily in shared imagination. Medieval Europe developed professional, legal, and governmental responses to supernatural dangers that were as sophisticated as their approaches to real-world problems, creating a civilization that was simultaneously rational and completely irrational. It was a society that could build cathedrals and develop complex legal systems, while also maintaining professional demon hunters and conducting formal trials for supernatural crimes. Medieval Europe achieved remarkable institutional sophistication in service of beliefs that were fundamentally divorced from observable reality, creating systems designed to manage invisible problems that consumed real resources and affected real lives. As the medieval period gradually gave way to the Renaissance and early modern era, the elaborate supernatural belief systems that had dominated European life for centuries began to encounter challenges from new forms of knowledge, changing social structures, and different approaches to understanding the natural world. But the death of medieval superstition was neither swift nor complete. It was a slow, uneven process that left behind traces that would persist for centuries. The decline of medieval superstition began with the gradual rise of empirical observation and scientific methodology. Renaissance scholars started developing approaches to knowledge that prioritized direct observation over inherited wisdom, experimental testing over traditional authority, and mathematical precision over mystical speculation. This shift didn't immediately eliminate supernatural beliefs, but it began to create alternative explanations for phenomena that had previously been attributed to demonic activity. The printing press played a crucial role in undermining medieval superstition by making books more widely available and promoting literacy among broader segments of the population. As more people gained access to written knowledge, they encountered different perspectives on natural phenomena and began to question traditional supernatural explanations. The democratization of knowledge gradually eroded the monopoly that religious and traditional authorities had maintained over explanations of mysterious events. Medical advances also contributed to the decline of supernatural beliefs by providing natural explanations for conditions that had previously been attributed to demonic possession, curse-induced illness, or spiritual contamination. As physicians developed better understanding of disease, anatomy, and pharmacology, they could offer treatments that were more effective than spiritual interventions, gradually shifting public confidence from supernatural to natural solutions. But the transition away from medieval superstition was complicated by the fact that many supernatural beliefs were deeply embedded in social, legal, and religious institutions that had significant power and influence. Church authorities who had spent centuries developing theological responses to supernatural threats were reluctant to abandon beliefs that had become central to their authority and identity. Legal systems that had evolved complex procedures for prosecuting supernatural crimes faced the challenge of adapting to new understanding that suggested many of these crimes were based on false premises. Courts had to gradually develop new approaches to cases involving alleged witchcraft, demon summoning, and magical activities without completely abandoning the legal frameworks that had been constructed around supernatural beliefs. Economic interests also complicated the transition away from superstition. The supernatural protection industry, including professional demon hunters, curse removal specialists, and blessed object manufacturers, had become a significant component of medieval economy. These industries had strong incentives to maintain public belief in supernatural threats and to resist new explanations that would eliminate demand for their services. The result was a gradual, uneven decline in supernatural beliefs that varied significantly by region, social class, and institutional context. Urban areas with access to new knowledge and diverse perspectives generally abandoned medieval superstitions more quickly than rural communities that remained isolated from intellectual developments. Educated elites often embraced new explanations, while common people continued to rely on traditional supernatural beliefs. Religious authorities developed complex compromise positions that attempted to maintain core spiritual beliefs while adapting to new natural knowledge. Church officials began distinguishing between legitimate supernatural phenomena, miracles, divine intervention, demonic activity confirmed by proper authority, and illegitimate superstition, folk magic, curse belief, unauthorized supernatural practices. This compromise allowed religious institutions to maintain their authority over spiritual matters, while distancing themselves from the more extreme supernatural beliefs that were becoming intellectually embarrassing. The Church essentially performed supernatural quality control, endorsing some mystical beliefs while condemning others as primitive superstition. But many medieval superstitions proved remarkably persistent, surviving the transition to modernity in modified forms that adapted to new social and intellectual contexts. Beliefs about luck, supernatural protection, and mystical influences on daily life didn't disappear. They evolved into forms that were compatible with more scientific worldviews. Modern superstitions about black cats, broken mirrors, spilled salt, and unlucky numbers are direct descendants of medieval supernatural beliefs, transmitted through centuries of cultural tradition. Despite major changes in formal knowledge and institutional authority, these beliefs persist because they address deep human anxieties about control, safety, and meaning that transcend specific historical contexts. The legacy of medieval superstition is also visible in modern popular culture, where supernatural themes continue to fascinate audiences despite widespread scientific literacy. Movies, television shows, and literature that feature demons, witches, curses, and supernatural threats tap into psychological patterns that were established during the medieval period, when European culture developed its foundational approaches to understanding invisible forces. Perhaps most remarkably, some medieval superstitions have found new life in modern contexts that give them apparent scientific legitimacy. Beliefs about the influence of lunar cycles, the power of positive thinking, and the importance of spiritual protection have been repackaged using contemporary vocabulary while maintaining essential supernatural assumptions that would be familiar to medieval believers. The persistence of supernatural belief in modern contexts reveals something profound about human psychology and the appeal of explanations that provide meaning, control, and community in the face of uncertainty. Medieval superstitions address fundamental human needs that haven't been eliminated by scientific advancement. The need to feel protected from invisible threats, the desire to influence uncertain outcomes, and the comfort of shared beliefs that create social solidarity. Medieval Europe's elaborate supernatural belief systems were ultimately expressions of deeper human anxieties about mortality, powerlessness, and the unknown. These anxieties didn't disappear with the development of scientific knowledge. They found new forms of expression that continue to shape human behavior and cultural production. The weird medieval superstitions that seem so absurd to modern observers were serious attempts by intelligent people to create meaningful protective responses to a world that seemed dangerous, unpredictable, and full of invisible threats. These beliefs provided psychological comfort, social cohesion, and practical guidance for daily life, even when they were based on false premises. In many ways, medieval superstition represents a fascinating example of human creativity and adaptability, the remarkable ability of human communities to develop elaborate, sophisticated responses to perceived challenges, even when those challenges exist primarily in collective imagination. Medieval Europe created an entire civilization around managing threats that weren't real, demonstrating both the power and the limitations of human belief systems. And so, as we drift off to sleep in our modern world, surrounded by electric lights that banish the darkness and scientific knowledge that explains most mysterious phenomena, we can perhaps understand why medieval people found comfort in their elaborate supernatural protections. They lived in a world that was genuinely dangerous and unpredictable, where infant mortality was high, disease was poorly understood, and natural disasters could destroy entire communities without warning. Their supernatural beliefs provided a sense of agency and protection in circumstances where they had little actual control over their fate. The rituals, prayers, and protective practices that seem so absurd to us provided real psychological benefit to people who faced genuine threats with limited resources and knowledge. Medieval superstitions remind us that human beings have always been creative meaning makers, capable of developing elaborate explanatory systems that help them navigate uncertainty and find purpose in difficult circumstances. These beliefs were ultimately expressions of hope that human actions could influence supernatural forces, that proper behavior could provide protection, and that the universe was meaningful rather than random. The medieval world was one where sneezing could threaten your soul, mirrors could steal your reflection, cats could summon demons, and going to sleep required extensive spiritual preparation. It was a world where every daily activity was fraught with supernatural significance, where normal human functions carried mystical implications, and where survival required constant vigilance against invisible enemies. But it was also a world where people believed that human actions mattered, that proper behavior could provide protection, and that the universe was filled with meaning rather than empty of purpose. Medieval people lived in terror of supernatural threats, but they also lived with the comfort of knowing that those threats could be managed through knowledge, ritual, and community support. Perhaps that's not such a bad way to end our journey into the wonderfully weird world of medieval superstition, with the recognition that even the most absurd beliefs often express something true about human needs, fears, and hopes. Medieval people may have been wrong about demons and soul theft and the supernatural dangers of sneezing, but they were right about the importance of community, the value of protective rituals, and the human need for meaning in the face of uncertainty. But before we drift off to sleep with our modern understanding of the world, let's explore a few more areas where medieval people found supernatural terror lurking in the most ordinary aspects of life. Because if there's one thing we can say about medieval superstition, it's that it was remarkably thorough in finding spiritual danger absolutely everywhere. Weather, for instance, wasn't simply meteorological phenomena to medieval minds. It was direct communication from supernatural forces, requiring constant interpretation and appropriate ritual response. Medieval people lived in a world where every storm, rainbow, and change in wind direction carried mystical significance that could determine their fate for days, weeks, or even years to come. Thunder was considered the voice of God expressing divine displeasure, but the specific meaning of thunderous communication depended on complex factors including timing, duration, and the number of individual thunderclaps. A single thunderclap was generally considered a warning. God was getting your attention about some transgression that needed immediate correction. Multiple thunderclaps, however, were interpreted as escalating divine anger that required increasingly desperate measures to appease. Medieval communities developed thunder counting protocols that resembled supernatural accounting systems. Community members would carefully track the number of thunderclaps during storms, consult local religious authorities about the theological implications, and organize appropriate penitential responses based on the perceived severity of divine displeasure. Some communities maintained thunder logbooks, detailed records of storm communications from God that were used to track patterns in divine mood and predict future supernatural weather events. But thunder interpretation was complicated by the fact that different types of thunder allegedly carried different spiritual messages. Rolling thunder was considered less serious than sharp, cracking thunder, which was thought to indicate immediate divine anger, requiring urgent response. Thunder that seemed to move from east to west was generally considered more positive than thunder moving from west to east, because eastward movement aligned with the direction of Jerusalem and suggested divine blessing rather than curse. Lightning presented even more complex interpretive challenges, because medieval people believed it was God's supernatural weapon, used to target specific individuals or communities for divine punishment. Being struck by lightning wasn't just random meteorological bad luck. It was evidence of serious spiritual transgression that had attracted direct divine intervention. Lightning survivors were often treated with suspicion because people assumed they must have committed some terrible sin to warrant such dramatic supernatural attention. But lightning interpretation went far beyond simple striking. The shape, color, and direction of lightning bolts were all considered meaningful supernatural communications. Forked lightning was thought to represent divine confusion or internal conflict in heaven, while straight lightning indicated clear divine purpose. Blue lightning was generally considered more divine than red lightning, which was associated with anger and punishment. Medieval communities developed lightning protection strategies that combined practical measures with supernatural defense systems. Lightning rods weren't invented until much later, but medieval people created elaborate spiritual protection systems designed to deflect divine electrical attacks. These systems involved community prayers during storms, blessed objects placed on building rooftops, and emergency religious ceremonies performed during dangerous weather events. Rain interpretation was equally complex because medieval people believed that precipitation patterns reflected divine judgment on community behavior. Gentle, steady rain was considered evidence of divine blessing and approval, while heavy, destructive rain indicated supernatural displeasure that required immediate corrective action. Drought was obviously a sign of serious divine anger, but too much rain was also problematic because it suggested that God was either punishing the community or testing their faith through agricultural challenges. Medieval communities developed rain prediction systems that combined meteorological observation with spiritual analysis. Local religious authorities would examine recent community behavior for potential sources of divine displeasure, predict likely supernatural weather responses, and organize preventive prayer campaigns designed to influence divine precipitation decisions. Some communities maintained weather specialists, essentially medieval meteorological priests, whose job was to interpret atmospheric signs and provide spiritual weather forecasting services. But perhaps the most elaborate medieval weather superstitions surrounded wind patterns, which were considered direct supernatural communication, requiring careful interpretation and immediate response. Different wind directions carried different spiritual messages. North winds brought warnings of danger. South winds indicated divine blessing. East winds suggested spiritual renewal. And west winds were associated with death and endings. The strength of wind was also supernaturally significant. Gentle breezes were considered normal divine communication, while strong winds indicated urgent supernatural messages requiring immediate attention. Hurricanes and severe windstorms were interpreted as supernatural emergencies, evidence that divine forces were extremely agitated about something and required dramatic human response to restore cosmic balance. Medieval people developed wind response protocols that involved community-wide actions designed to address whatever spiritual crisis had generated supernatural atmospheric disturbance. These protocols included massive prayer campaigns, community confessions of sin, emergency religious processions, and sometimes elaborate penitential ceremonies designed to appease whatever divine forces were expressing displeasure through meteorological violence. Some medieval communities employed professional wind interpreters, specialists who claimed expertise in decoding supernatural atmospheric communications and providing appropriate response recommendations. These interpreters would analyze wind patterns, consult religious authorities about theological implications, and organize community responses designed to address the spiritual crises that had allegedly generated unusual weather patterns. The economic impact of weather superstitions was enormous because medieval communities would divert significant resources towards spiritual weather management activities. During severe storms, entire communities would cease normal economic activity and focus on supernatural crisis response, investing time and money in religious ceremonies rather than practical storm preparation or damage mitigation. Medieval weather superstitions revealed the profound human need to find meaning and control in natural phenomena that were genuinely dangerous and unpredictable. Medieval people faced severe weather with limited technological protection, so they developed spiritual protection systems that provided psychological comfort and community solidarity, even when they didn't provide actual safety. If weather was divine communication requiring careful interpretation, then death was the ultimate supernatural transition that required elaborate protective measures to ensure proper spiritual departure and prevent the deceased from returning as malevolent supernatural entities. Medieval death superstitions were perhaps the most complex and anxiety-provoking beliefs in a culture already saturated with supernatural fear. Medieval people believed that death was not simply the end of biological function, but a dangerous supernatural transition during which the deceased person's soul was vulnerable to demonic interference, spiritual misdirection, and potential entrapment in earthly realms where dead people didn't belong. This belief led to the development of death management protocols that were designed to ensure proper spiritual departure while protecting the living from supernatural retaliation by confused or angry dead people. The moment of death was considered particularly dangerous because the departing soul could be intercepted by demons, misdirected by evil spirits, or simply become confused about its proper destination. Medieval people developed death assistance rituals designed to provide spiritual navigation support for departing souls who might otherwise become lost in supernatural territory and end up haunting their former communities. These death assistance rituals involve specific prayers, religious imagery, and careful positioning of the dying person to facilitate proper soul departure. The dying person had to face east, toward Jerusalem and the rising sun, to ensure that their soul would travel in the correct spiritual direction. Facing any other direction during death was thought to misdirect the soul toward dangerous supernatural territories, where it might be captured by evil forces or simply become permanently lost. The timing of death was also supernaturally significant. Dying during daylight hours was considered safer than dying at night, because darkness was associated with demonic activity and spiritual confusion. Medieval people would sometimes attempt to keep critically ill individuals alive until sunrise, reasoning that daylight death would provide better spiritual security for the departing soul. But death timing superstitions went beyond simple day-night considerations. Dying during certain holy days was considered particularly blessed because the spiritual atmosphere was supposedly more conducive to proper soul departure. Dying during unholy times, such as Friday the 13th or during eclipses, was thought to increase the risk of supernatural interference with the death process. Medieval people also believed that the physical appearance of dead bodies provided important information about the spiritual status of the deceased and potential supernatural threats to the living community. Bodies that appeared peaceful and unchanged after death were considered evidence of proper spiritual departure and divine blessing. Bodies that showed signs of decay, discoloration, or other changes were thought to indicate spiritual problems that might result in supernatural complications. The most feared death-related superstition involved bodies that appeared to be unnaturally preserved or showed signs of continued life after death. Medieval people believed that some dead individuals refused to depart properly and instead remained in their bodies as supernatural entities that posed serious threats to living communities. These undead individuals were thought to leave their graves at night to attack living people, spread disease, or generally cause supernatural havoc. Medieval communities developed undead detection procedures that involved careful examination of recently deceased individuals for signs of supernatural persistence. These examinations included checking for continued hair and nail growth, monitoring body temperature for signs of unnatural warmth, and observing burial sites for evidence of nocturnal activity by supposedly dead individuals. When undead activity was suspected, medieval communities would organize elaborate supernatural intervention procedures designed to force proper death and spiritual departure. These procedures included driving stakes through suspected undead individuals, decapitating bodies that showed signs of supernatural persistence, and burning corpses that were believed to harbor dangerous spiritual entities. The burial process itself was considered critically important for preventing supernatural complications from improperly managed death. Bodies had to be buried in consecrated ground that had been blessed by religious authorities and protected by holy symbols. Burial in unconsecrated ground was thought to leave dead individuals vulnerable to demonic capture and potential transformation into evil supernatural entities. The depth of burial was also significant because shallow graves were thought to allow dead individuals to more easily return to the surface and cause problems for living communities. Deep burial was considered safer because it made it more difficult for undead individuals to escape their graves and engage in supernatural mischief. Medieval people developed grave protection systems that involved blessed objects placed in coffins, religious symbols carved on tombstones, and ongoing spiritual maintenance of burial sites. Some communities employed professional grave watchers, whose job was to monitor burial sites for signs of supernatural activity and provide immediate intervention if dead individuals showed signs of improper spiritual behavior. The most elaborate death superstitions involved preventing dead individuals from returning to their former homes and families. Medieval people believed that recently deceased individuals often became confused about their new spiritual status and would attempt to resume their previous lives, causing serious supernatural problems for their surviving relatives. These return prevention strategies included changing the arrangement of furniture in houses where people had died, sealing windows and doors through which dead individuals might attempt to re-enter their former homes, and performing spiritual cleansing ceremonies designed to remove any residual supernatural presence left behind by the deceased. Some medieval families would temporarily abandon houses where people had died, allowing time for any confused spiritual presence to dissipate before returning to normal residence. Other families employed spiritual specialists to perform house cleansing ceremonies that would encourage proper spiritual departure while protecting living family members from supernatural interference by dead relatives who were having trouble accepting their new status. Medieval death superstitions reveal the profound anxiety that surrounded one of life's most universal experiences. Death wasn't simply a biological event. It was a supernatural crisis that could affect entire communities if not properly managed through elaborate spiritual protocols designed to ensure that dead people stayed dead and living people remained safely alive. Finally, let's explore one last area where medieval people found supernatural terror lurking in the most necessary human activities: travel. In the modern world, travel is often seen as an adventure or opportunity, occasionally complicated by traffic delays or airline food. In medieval Europe, travel was essentially a journey through supernatural territory populated by invisible entities that were actively hostile to human mobility and determined to trap, corrupt, or destroy unwary travellers. Medieval people believed that leaving familiar territory was spiritually dangerous because it meant abandoning the protective spiritual infrastructure of their home communities and venturing into areas where local supernatural forces might not recognize their spiritual credentials. Every journey was essentially an unauthorized visit to territories controlled by potentially hostile supernatural entities who might not appreciate human intrusion. This belief led to the development of travel protection systems that were more complex than modern international security protocols. Medieval travelers couldn't simply pack their belongings and depart. They had to prepare spiritually, obtain supernatural protection, and carefully plan their routes to minimize exposure to known supernatural dangers. The timing of travel departure was critically important because different times carried different levels of supernatural risk. Leaving on certain days of the week was considered particularly dangerous. Tuesday and Friday were generally avoided because they were associated with war and death respectively. Some regions maintained detailed calendars of safe and dangerous travel days based on complex calculations involving saints' days, lunar phases, and seasonal supernatural activity patterns. The direction of travel was equally significant. Traveling east was generally considered safer because it aligned with the direction of Jerusalem and divine blessing. Traveling west was thought to be dangerous because it moved towards sunset and the realm of darkness. North travel was associated with death and cold, while south travel was connected to warmth and life, but also to dangerous spiritual territories where demons allegedly congregated. Medieval travelers developed elaborate route planning strategies designed to minimize exposure to supernatural threats while still reaching their intended destinations. These strategies involved avoiding known supernatural danger zones, timing travel to coincide with periods of reduced supernatural activity, and coordinating travel schedules with religious festivals that were thought to provide enhanced spiritual protection. Crossroads were considered particularly dangerous because they were believed to be supernatural gathering places where demons, evil spirits, and other malevolent entities would congregate to prey on travelers. Medieval people would often take longer routes to avoid crossroads, or if crossroads were unavoidable, they would perform protective rituals before approaching these supernatural danger zones. Bridges presented similar supernatural hazards because they were thought to be transition zones between different spiritual territories. Medieval people believed that bridges were often guarded by supernatural entities who demanded tribute or challenged travelers to supernatural contests. Some bridges were considered so dangerous that medieval communities would maintain alternative river crossing methods rather than risk supernatural confrontation with bridge-dwelling entities. Forest travel was considered the most dangerous form of medieval journey because forests were believed to be populated by an entire ecosystem of supernatural threats, including witches, demons, fairy folk, wild spirits, and various other entities that were hostile to human presence. Medieval travelers would often hire armed escorts not just for protection against human bandits, but for supernatural security against invisible forest-dwelling threats. The protective measures for forest travel were particularly elaborate because they had to address multiple categories of supernatural danger simultaneously. Travelers would carry blessed objects designed to repel demons, iron items to discourage fairy interference, religious medallions to provide divine protection, and specific herbs that were thought to confuse or repel various forest-dwelling supernatural entities. Some medieval communities developed professional travel guide services that specialized in supernatural route planning and protection. These guides claimed expertise in supernatural geography, knowledge of which areas were controlled by which supernatural entities, what times were safest for travel through specific territories, and what protective measures were most effective against different categories of supernatural threats. The most elaborate medieval travel superstitions involved overnight stops during long journeys. Medieval travelers couldn't simply stop wherever they became tired. They had to carefully select sleeping locations that provided adequate supernatural protection while avoiding areas that were known to be supernaturally dangerous during nighttime hours. Inns and taverns were preferred stopping places, not just for comfort and security, but because they were often blessed by religious authorities and equipped with spiritual protection systems designed to shelter travelers from supernatural threats. Some medieval inns specialized in supernatural security, offering blessed rooms, protective rituals, and emergency spiritual assistance for travelers who encountered supernatural problems during their journeys. But even with proper supernatural precautions, medieval travel remained dangerous because travelers were believed to be particularly vulnerable to supernatural attack when they were away from the spiritual protection of their home communities. This vulnerability led to the development of portable protection systems that travelers could carry with them to maintain spiritual security during their journeys. These portable protection systems included blessed objects that provided general supernatural defense, specific religious items designed to address particular categories of supernatural threats, and emergency spiritual supplies that could be used if travelers encountered unexpected supernatural dangers during their journeys. Medieval travel superstitions reveal the profound anxiety that surrounded human mobility in a world where people believed that leaving home meant entering hostile supernatural territory. Travel wasn't simply physical movement, it was spiritual adventure that required careful planning, extensive preparation, and constant vigilance against invisible threats that were believed to be particularly active in areas where humans were unfamiliar and vulnerable. The elaborate travel protection systems that medieval people developed demonstrate the remarkable human capacity for creating complex solutions to perceived problems, even when those problems exist primarily in collective imagination. Medieval travelers invested enormous time, energy, and resources in protecting themselves from supernatural threats that were probably no more real than modern fears of airplane turbulence or hotel room germs. But like all medieval superstitions, travel beliefs served important psychological and social functions. They provided structure and meaning for activities that were genuinely dangerous and unpredictable, created opportunities for community cooperation and mutual support, and offered psychological comfort in circumstances where travelers had limited actual control over their safety and security. And so we return to our modern beds, in our electrically lit homes, in our scientifically understood world, with perhaps a new appreciation for the elaborate spiritual gymnastics that our medieval ancestors performed in their daily struggle to survive in a universe they believed was actively trying to kill them in creative and supernatural ways. Medieval people lived in constant negotiation with invisible forces, turning every ordinary activity into a complex spiritual challenge that required knowledge, preparation, and community support. They created elaborate protection systems for threats that didn't exist while facing real dangers with limited resources and incomplete understanding. But in their elaborate superstitions, we can see something beautiful about human resilience and creativity. The remarkable ability to find meaning, develop community responses, and create protective rituals that provide psychological comfort even in the most challenging circumstances. Medieval superstitions were ultimately expressions of hope disguised as fear, attempts to create human agency in circumstances where people had little actual control over their fate. Sweet dreams. And remember, if you sneeze while reading this, make sure to sneeze to the right, just in case the medieval people knew something we've forgotten. And if you hear thunder tonight, maybe count the claps, just to be safe. After all, in a world full of genuine mysteries, a little protective ritual never hurt anyone, even if the threats it guards against exist only in our wonderfully creative human imagination.